The diamond was a shard of ice against her skin. Elara Vance had worn the Duke of Blackwood's ring for 3 months, and in all that time, it had never once felt warm. It sat on her finger like a tiny, ornate cage, a constant reminder of the gilded prison her life had become. From her window, she watched the last of the afternoon sun spill across the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor, a place of suffocating perfection. The silence in the house was a living thing, a heavy presence that muted the chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves, pressing down on her until her own breath felt like an intrusion. She was to be a duchess. The village girls who had once been her friends now looked at her with a mixture of awe and sharp-edged envy. Her father, a man whose ambitions had always outstripped his means, saw her not as a daughter, but as his greatest acquisition. He preened at the society dinners they were now invited to, basking in the reflected glory of her engagement. He did not see the way Duke Alistair Beaumont's eyes passed over her as if she were another piece of furniture, functional and necessary, but unworthy of particular notice. Alistair was a man carved from granite and shadow. His title was ancient, his wealth immeasurable, and his heart, by all accounts, impenetrable. He was not cruel, not in the way of loud words or harsh actions. His cruelty was one of omission. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice a low, level monotone that never betrayed a hint of emotion. Their dinners were exercises in silent endurance, the clinking of silver against porcelain the only conversation. He would retreat to his study for hours, the faint scratch of his pen on paper the only sign he was still in the same wing of the house. His fingers, she had noted in one of their few close encounters over a document, were perpetually stained with a faint trace of black ink at the cuticles, as if he sought to write the world into an order that his feelings could never disrupt. Her initial hope, a fragile, fluttering thing, had long since starved in the cold atmosphere of their courtship. She had imagined that perhaps, behind the formidable facade, there was a man who could be reached. She had tried. She had spoken of books, of music, of the changing seasons. He would incline his head, offer a clipped "indeed," and the conversation would die, its fragile wings broken against the wall of his indifference. Her hope, once a steady flame, now flickered like a candle in a draughty hall, threatening to go out with every cold glance. She was a ghost in his house, a placeholder for the title of Duchess. He required an heir, a respectable hostess, a woman to manage his household with quiet efficiency. He had chosen her, she suspected, precisely for her quietness, for the desperate circumstances of her family that would ensure her gratitude and compliance. He had not bargained for a heart, or a mind, or a spirit that was slowly, painfully, suffocating. The arrangement had been proposed not with a whisper of romance, but with the cold finality of a business contract. He had called upon her father, the two men closeted in the study for an hour. Then she had been summoned. Alistair stood by the fireplace, tall and imposing, his dark coat absorbing the light from the room. He had not kneeled. He had not spoken of affection. "Miss Vance," he had said, his voice as crisp as autumn leaves. "Your father and I have reached an agreement. I am in need of a wife. You are, I am told, of good character and breeding. Your family will be secured against any future hardship. I offer you the position of Duchess of Blackwood. I will be a considerate husband, and I will expect your loyalty in return." It was not a proposal. It was a hiring. Her father had beamed, his face flushed with triumph. Elara had felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She looked at the Duke, searching his face for any sign of warmth, of humanity, and found only a disciplined emptiness. His eyes, a deep, turbulent brown like disturbed earth, held no light. She had accepted, because what other choice did she have? To refuse would be to condemn her family to ruin and herself to a life of quiet shame as the woman who had turned down a duke. So she had nodded, a small, jerky movement of her head. and he had slid the cold, heavy ring onto her finger. The transaction was complete. Now, 3 months later, the weight of that transaction had become unbearable. Tomorrow was the annual village summer fete, held on the green at the edge of the ducal estate. It was to be her first major public appearance with him, a formal presentation to his tenants and the local gentry. The entire village would be there, their eyes on her, the girl who had caught the cold, untouchable duke. They would see the diamond on her finger and the fine silk of her dress, and they would envy her. They would not see the hollowness inside her, the slow erosion of her soul. Something inside her, a core of resilience she thought had been extinguished, was beginning to harden. It was the pressure, she supposed, that was turning soft sentiment into something sharp and unyielding. She could not bear another day of the silence. She could not bear another glance that looked through her. She could not become the Duchess of Blackwood, a silent automaton in a cold, beautiful house. She would rather be ruined than erased. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the window, the moonlight painting her room in shades of silver and grey. She twisted the ring on her finger, the sharp edges of the diamond biting into her skin. A decision, terrifying and absolute, settled in her heart. It was a choice. Her choice. For the first time since he had walked into her life, she felt a flicker of power. It was the desperate power of a cornered animal, but it was power nonetheless. She would not simply fade away. If she was to be a ghost, she would have one final, spectacular haunting. The fete was a kaleidoscope of vibrant colour and cheerful noise, a stark contrast to the muted tones of Blackwood Manor. Tents of striped canvas dotted the green, vendors sold ribbons and pies, and a small orchestra played slightly off-key waltzes. Elara walked beside the Duke, her arm resting lightly on his, a study in porcelain composure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She smiled at the curtsying wives and nodding tenants, her lips feeling stiff and unnatural. Alistair was, as always, impeccably remote. He moved through the crowd with an air of detached authority, the people parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. He was polite, correct, but utterly distant. He spoke when spoken to, his replies brief and formal. He did not look at her. He did not touch her hand where it lay on his arm. She was an accessory, a necessary part of the ducal costume for the day. Lady Beatrice Finch, a local baron's daughter who had long considered herself the front-runner for the position of Duchess, approached them with a smile that was all teeth. "Your Grace," she purred, her eyes flicking dismissively over Elara. "And Miss Vance, how quaint you look." The insult was veiled, but the barb hit its mark. Before Elara could react, Alistair spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Lady Beatrice, my fiancé's taste is, as in all things, impeccable." It was not a compliment to Elara. It was a dismissal of Lady Beatrice. It was a defense of his property, not his partner. Still, the woman's face tightened, and she retreated with a clipped curtsy. For a moment, a foolish, treacherous part of Elara felt a surge of gratitude. He had defended her. But the feeling curdled as soon as it formed. He had not defended her. He had defended his choice, his judgment. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. He had spoken more to Lady Beatrice in that single exchange than he had to Elara all morning. They moved through the fete, a silent, regal pair, the object of every stare and whispered comment. Elara felt the pressure building with every step, every false smile. She saw the envy in the eyes of young women and the calculating approval in the eyes of their mothers. They were all looking at the ring, the dress, the title. They saw a fantasy, a fairy tale come to life. They did not see the truth. Later, she found herself exploring the quieter corners of the estate while Alistair was occupied with the estate manager. She discovered a high stone wall, almost completely hidden by overgrown ivy. In it was a heavy oak door, its iron handle cold and stiff. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion she had not felt in months, stirred within her. The door was locked. She felt a strange sense of kinship with whatever was behind it. Another beautiful, inaccessible thing, locked away from the world. Her artistic sensibilities, long dormant, were piqued. She was a keen observer of nature, and her small book of botanical sketches was her only private solace. She wondered what forgotten garden lay behind the wall. The thought stayed with her, a small mystery in a life that had become painfully predictable. A few weeks later, a package arrived for her. It was not from the Duke, but had been ordered by his staff. Inside was a set of the finest drawing pencils and a portfolio of heavy, cream-colored paper. There was no note. It was another of his strange, impersonal kindnesses. It was a gesture that acknowledged her interest, but required no intimacy, no conversation. It was a gift that kept her at a distance while still providing for her. His rare words of praise, or in this case, his actions, felt like coins dropped into a beggar's cup, startling and insufficient. He saw that she drew, so he provided paper. He did not ask what she drew or why. The discovery of the locked garden and the gift of the art supplies seeded a new kind of resolve in her. She began to watch him more closely, not with the hopeful eyes of a fiancé, but with the sharp, analytical gaze of a strategist. She noticed things. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when her father spoke of leveraging their new connection for business. She noticed the deep, almost imperceptible sigh he would release when he finally closed himself in his study at night. And she noticed that the path to the locked garden was the only place on the estate where his footsteps ever seemed to veer from their purposeful, direct lines. The key was an accident. Or perhaps not. Mrs. Pembroke, the Duke's severe but not unkind housekeeper, dropped a large ring of keys near the library. As Elara helped the older woman gather them, a small, ornate iron key skittered under a table. "Oh, leave that one, miss," Mrs. Pembroke had said, a little too quickly. "It's for nothing important, just an old potting shed." But Elara had seen the shape. It matched the lock on the heavy oak door. She retrieved it when the housekeeper was gone, her fingers trembling. She waited until dusk, when the house was quiet and the Duke was locked in his study. The key turned in the lock with a rusty groan. The door swung inward, revealing not a shed, but a world. It was a vast glass house, shimmering in the twilight. Inside, the air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms. It was a riot of life and color, a stark, shocking contrast to the sterile perfection of the manor. And in the center, on a raised bed of moss and bark, grew the most astonishing flowers she had ever seen. They were pale, almost translucent, with long, delicate tendrils that seemed to float in the air. They were unearthly and beautiful, a fragile, living secret in the heart of all that cold stone. Ghost orchids. She knew them from her books. They were notoriously difficult to cultivate, requiring precise conditions and unwavering patience. A sound behind her made her spin around. Alastair stood in the doorway, his face a mask of thunder. For the first time, she saw raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes. Fury, and something else beneath it. Something that looked like pain. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she did not back down. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I wanted to see it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "They are beautiful." "This place is private," he bit out, stepping into the glass house. The door swung shut behind him, encasing them in the warm, fragrant air. "Like everything else about you, Your Grace," she countered, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "You share your name, your home, your table. You share nothing of yourself." His anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a profound weariness, He walked past her to the orchids, his broad shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. He touched one of the delicate petals with a gentleness she could never have imagined, his ink-stained finger a stark contrast to the flower's spectral white. "They were hers," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Genevieve's. She loved them." The name hung in the air between them. Lady Beatrice's spiteful words came rushing back. Still mourning his lost love. "She was my first fiancée," Alistair continued, his back still to her. "We were to be married 10 years ago. She died. A riding accident 2 weeks before the wedding." He spoke the words flatly, as if reciting a historical fact, but Elara could feel the decade of grief packed into them. The silence in the dining hall was heavy, like a velvet curtain dropped over a stage where no play would ever be performed. This was the play, and he had been its sole, silent audience for years. "She was like this place," he said, gesturing vaguely at the vibrant, chaotic life around them, full of warmth and colour. "When she was gone, I thought it was better to feel nothing. I locked the door. I convinced myself that control, order, silence, that they were a kind of strength, that emotion was a liability I could no longer afford." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes, for the first time, were not empty. They were filled with a bleak, desolate sorrow. "I chose you, Elara, not because you were meek. I saw a strength in you, a quiet resilience. I thought you would be strong enough to endure the terms, to live in the silence I had built around myself. It was a profoundly selfish, cowardly act. I was asking you to live in a tomb with me because I was too afraid to try and live again." The confession laid him bare. It was not an apology, not a declaration. It was a statement of fact, an explanation for the coldness, the distance, the suffocating silence. He had shown her the wound. He had explained the bars of his own cage, but he had not offered to open the door. He had simply invited her to understand why it was locked. She left the glasshouse with his words echoing in her mind. She understood him now. She understood the ghost that haunted Blackwood Manor was not Genevieve, but Alistair himself. And she understood, with a terrible, clarifying certainty, that his understanding of her strength was a sentence, not a compliment. He wanted her to be strong enough to survive him, not to challenge him. Which brought her back to the fete, to the crowds and the music and the suffocating weight of expectation. His confession from the night before had not changed his public demeanor. He was still the cold, remote duke. He had shown her his vulnerability in private, but in public, she was still just an accessory. She realized he expected her to accept this, to understand his pain and to quietly adapt to it, to live in the space he allotted her. He expected her to be patient. He expected her to wait. She would not. Her heart ached for the man who tended his lost love's flowers in secret, but she would not sacrifice her own life to his grief. Love, if it was to mean anything, could not be a passive endurance test. It had to be a choice, an action. And if he could not act, then she would. The moment came near the end of the day, as the speeches were being made from the pavilion. The mayor was droning on, praising the Duke's generosity. Alistair stood beside her, a pillar of aristocratic indifference. The entire village was watching. It was the perfect stage. She took a deep breath, the scent of cut grass and summer roses filling her lungs. She turned to him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the mayor's speech. He turned his head, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The mayor faltered, the crowd's attention shifting to them. "I find I cannot accept your generous proposition," she said, her voice growing stronger, imbued with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. The silence that fell over the green was absolute. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. "The position of Duchess of Blackwood is one I am unsuited for. I thank you for the honor of your consideration, but I must respectfully decline." Her words were precise, formal, echoing the language of their first, cold meeting. This was not the emotional outburst of a jilted woman. This was the calm, rational termination of a contract. With deliberate, steady movements, she pulled the diamond ring from her finger. The ice was gone. Her skin felt warm, alive. The murmuring in the crowd swelled to a collective gasp. Her father, standing nearby, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Lady Beatrice's face was a mask of triumphant shock. Ilara held the ring out. Alistair did not move. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable. She stepped closer, took his hand, his large, warm, ink-stained hand, and turned it palm up. His skin was calloused from riding, but his touch sent a jolt through her that was anything but cold. She placed the ring into the center of his palm. "I return this to you," she said, her voice for his ears alone now. "I will not live in a beautiful, silent tomb." She closed his fingers over the ring and stepped back. She had done it. She had detonated her own life in the most public way imaginable. Ruin was now a certainty. But it was a ruin of her own making. She felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. She met his gaze, ready for the cold fury, the dismissal, the final, icy end. He looked down at the heavy ring nestled in his palm. Then he looked back up at her. And he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a slow, quiet curving of his lips. But it transformed his entire face. It reached his eyes, and for the first time she saw them truly light up, the turbulent brown warming like earth in the spring sun. It was a smile of surprise, of admiration, of profound, soul-shaking relief. The crowd saw only the public humiliation of a duke. They saw a woman's shocking rebellion. They could not comprehend the expression on his face. They interpreted it as a smirk of disdain, a dismissal of her foolish theatrics. But Ilara understood. She saw everything in that smile. He had tested her, not cruelly, but desperately. He had presented her with the worst of himself, with his coldness, his silence, his locked doors, waiting to see if she would simply accept it. He had chosen her for her resilience, but he had secretly, desperately, hoped for her rebellion. He did not want a duchess who could endure his prison. He wanted a woman who would tear down the walls. Her public refusal was not an insult. It was the answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask. It was proof that she was not a possession to be managed, but a partner to be met. It was the first strike of a hammer against his carefully constructed tomb, and he was smiling, because he finally saw the light getting in. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that she understood. Then, before anyone could react, she turned and walked away. She did not run. She walked with her head held high, past the stunned faces of the villagers, past her father's apoplectic glare, away from the title and the wealth and the cold, suffocating silence. She was walking towards an uncertain future, but for the first time in months, she was walking free. 6 months passed. The scandal of the broken engagement had been a firestorm, then it had faded to embers, and finally to ash. Ilara lived quietly at home, enduring her father's simmering resentment and her mother's fretful anxieties. She had her drawing pencils and her portfolio, and she spent her days capturing the intricate beauty of the world around her, the veins on a leaf, the frost on a window pane. She was poor, and her prospects were ruined, but she was herself. She had refused the Duke's generous financial settlement, sent back with a polite but firm note. She would not be paid for her time as a potential duchess. She had half expected him to pursue her, but he had not. The silence from Blackwood Manor was as absolute as it had ever been. A part of her, The part that had seen the truth in his smile ached with disappointment. Perhaps she had misread it all. Perhaps it had just been a final, cruel irony. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was sketching the bare branches of an old oak tree, she heard the sound of a lone horse approaching. She looked up to see a rider dismounting at the edge of her family's modest property. It was Alistair. He was not dressed as a duke. He wore simple, well-made country clothes. There was no carriage, no footman. He was alone. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. He stopped a few feet away, holding his riding gloves in one hand. His fingers, she saw, were still faintly stained with ink. "Elara," he said. Her name on his lips sounded different now, not like a title or a label, but like a word he cherished. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice even, though her heart had begun a frantic, hopeful rhythm. "I thought it best to give you time," he said. "Time to be certain that your choice was your own, with no influence from me." "And are you here to try and influence me now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. A faint echo of that smile touched his lips. "I am here to surrender," he said. "You were right. I asked you to share my life, but I kept the doors to it locked. I wanted a partner, but I behaved like a jailer. The smile, that day, it was because I realized you were the strongest person I had ever met, strong enough to save me from myself. But it was not your duty to do so." He took a step closer. He was not carrying a ring box. Instead, he held out a small velvet pouch. "I have been working," he said, "not on estate ledgers. I have been learning to open doors." She took the pouch. Inside was not a jewel, but a locket on a simple silver chain. It was made of glass, and within it, perfectly preserved, was a single, ethereal ghost orchid. "I will not offer you a position again, Elara," he said, his voice earnest and stripped of all its former artifice. "Or a contract. I am here to ask if you would be willing to build a life with me. A life with open doors, and conversation, and warmth. A life where we tend to the gardens together. I am asking for your partnership, if you will have it. I am asking for you." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the man before her. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a deep, profound joy. He had understood. He had not just admired her rebellion, he had learned from it. He had changed. She looked from the delicate orchid in her hand to the man who had cultivated it, the man who had finally learned that the rarest things cannot survive in the cold and the dark. "Alistair," she said, speaking his given name for the very first time. "I think I should very much like that." The smile that broke across his face was one of pure, unadulterated light. He closed the distance between them and, with a gentleness that spoke of reverence, he took her hand. It was not the formal, distant touch of a duke, but the warm, steady grasp of a man who had finally come home. Blackwood Manor was still waiting, but it was no longer a tomb. It was simply a house, ready to be filled with light and life, and the quiet, steady sound of two people choosing to begin again. True worth, she now knew, was not something granted by society or a title, but something claimed by a single, courageous choice.